Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the NCRCRD, and I'm pleased to um, introduce Kristen Runge from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's going to be presenting a webinar, which is a part of our placemaking webinar series. We've had several presentations from universities across the North Central region. And so the title of her topic is Placemaking and Stakeholder-Centered Community Branding. Kristen is co-leader of the Community Vitality and Placemaking team at the University of Wisconsin Extension. And as part of her work, she conducts public opinion research and designs communication strategies for municipalities, county governments, and economic development organizations. Her current projects include explorations of how citizen engagement and local media use affects community cohesion, and the ways in which strong community brands affect place-related satisfaction for residents and other community stakeholders. And I also wanted to remind you that our next placemaking webinar is on February 9th at 2 p.m. and Kurt Schindler from Michigan State University will be giving that webinar, and that will be the last of the series. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to pass it on to Kristen. And thanks again for all the participants joining in, and thank you, Kristen, for preparing this presentation.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about kind of what's going on here at UW Extension with some of the branding initiatives we have for community branding. And before I start, I'd actually like to acknowledge a couple of, several groups of people that have helped with this process all along. My partner in crime for community branding is Victoria Solomon in Greene County in Wisconsin. She's a community resource development educator that is working closely with me to do a branding initiative in a couple of communities in Wisconsin, Belleville and Cottage Grove right now that are going to be the basis for a kit that we put together for people who want to do some branding work. So you can look in the next year or two for that to come out. And then my other partners in crime when it comes to placemaking and branding is the Community Vitality and Placemaking team, and the co-leaders for that are Todd Johnson, Nathan Sandwick, and myself. But I see a couple of names on today's participant list, including Steve Grabow and Josh Clement, that are also members of the team. Steve is one of our emeritus members. They've both done significant work in placemaking. And so what I talk about here today relates to what we all kind of collectively do, and is a little bit of the work that we do with placemaking and branding in particular for me. So let me start first by saying today that what I really want to cover is one aspect of branding. Branding is a huge initiative that communities undertake. It's a months-long, sometimes a year-long process. It involves a lot of different people and a lot of different stakeholders. And so in the kind of the 25 minutes I have today, I really want to focus on the hardest part of that, which is also the first step, and that's discovering the brand that a community has. So that's what I'll talk about today. And feel free as I'm talking to type questions in the chat feature. I'll try to, as best I can, to keep my eye on that and answer questions you all have as we go along. And then at the end, too, we'll take some questions. So let's just look at this idea of discovering our brand a little bit. Well, if we want to discover a brand, it probably helps us to at least define the term brand. And this is this big abstract term that we borrow in a community branding from consumer products marketing. And so when we look at that literature, kind of the textbook literature for brands from a consumer product standpoint, we really see that there are a number of different brand definitions that have a couple of things in common. You know, a brand is a name, a term, a symbol of some sort, the stripes for Adidas, the swoosh for Nike, the M for McDonald's, the golden arches for McDonald's. So it's those visual elements, those audible elements that define one seller's product, good or service, as distinct from that of other products, goods, or services. And when we think about the importance of the Nike swoosh and the Adidas stripes, we can look at two completely identical products, tennis shoes of the same color, same function and whatnot, but we think different things about Nike than we do about Adidas because the brand names and the identification is that different. So brand from that standpoint is sometimes a reason to choose one similar product over another similar product. It can also be thought of sometimes as the set of expectations, the memories we have, the stories we tell ourselves about that brand. One of the first brands when we're thinking of consumer products that we learn in our lifetime, or modern Americans learn, is McDonald's. Kids, long before they can read, learn that the McDonald's symbol means playland and French fries and apple pies and all sorts of great things. And from those various earliest stages, we're developing memories and associations around those brands. So that involves expectations, memories, and stories. But the one I like the best is kind of the one that's at the bottom, and it says that a brand is the intangible sum of a product's attributes. It's all of these things we really can't put into words that tell us about that product. Now, that's all product-based, consumer product-based, right? We're dealing with much different things when we're dealing with places. So how we apply that, we twist it a little bit. We make it a little bit different. So when we think of brand in terms of a community, a brand for a community is really a collection of experiences we have with that community. Oftentimes, these are emotions or memories that we attach to a particular product or an organization or a place in this case. And those memories, those experiences, those emotions form the basis of the attitude that we have towards the brand, towards the community. And when we think of some of kind of the cherished places in the United States, places that evoke a lot of emotion. In young children, a child that's been to Walt Disney World would say that's certainly a place, a branded place in every sense of the word for Walt Disney World, a commercially branded place that evokes of a lot of emotion. New York City, Los Angeles, Hollywood, all of these have these ideas that are involved in our experience of them. And this notion of brand, this definition of brand, the one that I think is most useful to placemaking, is really related to the network model of memory, a concept that we borrow from psychology. And this tells us that every time we encounter this place, Wisconsin Dells, Chicago, the Pacific Northwest, every memory and experience we have, good, bad, or otherwise, is networked by memory nodes somewhere in our brain. So when we think of a place, and let's go back to the idea of a commercial place like McDonald's, very simple, much more easy to identify that than it is a community, which is a much more complex thing. But when we walk into McDonald's, when you take a child into McDonald's, what they're experiencing as McDonald's involves the taste of the food that they've had there, the smell of the food, the sound of their feet on the tiled floors as they're walking through, the ring of the cash register, the experience of jumping in a ball pit, all of these sensory experiences, plus all of the memories they have associated with that one place, McDonald's, light up in our minds. And from a perspective of what is going on in the mind of our consumer, or our resident, if we're talking about community, is that very complex idea of what is this place as an entity to the individual. And so that's kind of the background of the ideas that we operate under when we're talking about brands for a community. We are really looking at, in terms of a community, how do we emphasize positive brand associations, positive memories, and positive experiences in a way that help us push that community forward. So that's a lot of great big definitions. When we think of branding, and when we use the term branding, oftentimes we use branding and the term marketing interchangeably. And I want to just kind of define these things separately and focus solely on the branding. Community branding is when we are working with the community to identify the enduring essence of that community, the thing that involves its reputations, the thoughts, the feelings, the expectations that form some sort of compelling promise to the people and the stakeholders that are associated with that community. In other words, it's really what makes a community special. That's what a community brand is. Community marketing is related. Community branding and community marketing are sisters. They're not twins, they're just sisters. Community marketing is the activities, the institutions, the processes that's involved in creating and communicating, particularly communicating, and delivering value in a manner that propels a community towards its goals. So it tends to be the strategy and the tactics used to sell a community in some way towards an external audience, sometimes an internal audience, but oftentimes an external audience. So with branding, we're not really talking about the selling of the community, we're talking about creating a valuable identity for the community. And by valuable here, I mean not necessarily in monetary terms, but in terms of the degree to which a community brand and identity is cherished and articulated within the community. So community branding versus community marketing. When we're building a community brand, because there are these two definitions, and we oftentimes, especially in those of us in advertising and marketing, are really guilty of using these terms interchangeably when we shouldn't. But building a community brand involves discovering that community's identity, identifying some sort of target market, and not necessarily in the sense of selling the community, but identifying people that we might want to communicate the community to in some way, articulating a long-term strategy for the community, creating logos or symbols or some sort of visual element of the community that is representative of what that community really means. Oftentimes it involves collecting a set of images that identify the community in its unique places, and then telling the community story in some way. So that's what involving building a brand for a community involved. It doesn't, because it's not marketing, when we're identifying that brand and building that brand, we don't necessarily engage in short-term marketing material creation. That comes, and it's often associated with, but it comes later. And it often might lead to an advertising campaign, but it doesn't specifically involve an advertising campaign. Again, it's just identifying what that enduring essence of the community is in a way that articulates it. So that's a lot of definitions going into this. I'm focusing today just on that one aspect of discovering community identity, and so let's delve into that just a little bit deeper. When we're looking at community brand, there are some specific elements that we see are true to all sorts of successfully branded communities across the nation. And I'm taking this from the sources at the end of the PowerPoint today, but I'm taking this particular list from Philip Kotler, who is a marketing professor that did a lot of groundwork in consumer products company, but also kind of dipped his toes into marketing places. And he's got some really good writing out there that you'll see at the end of the PowerPoint today. But when we think of communities that have these really robust brands, for me at least, three of the big ones are Silicon Valley, Broadway, which is a neighborhood in New York City, of course, and Hollywood. And when we think of these brands, we immediately say Silicon Valley, and we think of technology, we think of pushing computers forward, we think of wealth generation, we think of this place in California where people dress casually and they make lots of money and it's very exciting. Broadway, we think of live theater, we think of music, we think of the lights and the excitement. Hollywood, we think of film. We immediately know what these communities are about. And when we look at their brands, we think with the brand for Silicon Valley, it's valid. It absolutely describes what that community is like. That's one of the core consistent principles that we see in good, robust community brands, is that they're valid. Second thing we see is that they're believable. These community brands really stand for what that community, really represent what that community stands for. They're very simple. We can describe the community in maybe a simple sentence based on the brands that they use. They're very appealing to us. They're attractive in some way. We're attracted to really successfully branded communities. And they're distinctive. They describe how that community is unique as compared to any other community that is similar. There are other places that do technology development. Thinking back in the 1980s, in particular, the corridor around Boston, a high-tech area. IBM was located there. Doesn't have the same cachet, that northeastern tech corridor, as Silicon Valley does. So Silicon Valley has not only the valid, believable, the simple, but very appealing and very distinctive. There are other places that we can find live theater, the West End in London, for example, doesn't have the same cachet as Broadway. So we're really looking to emphasize those things in good community brands. That's great. If you've got a large city like Hollywood in California or Silicon Valley, branding might come easy, but most of us really don't deal with communities. Some of us do, but most of us don't deal with communities on that scale. So when we think about community branded elements for smaller communities, those same principles still hold true. I've got pictures on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint you're looking at of Marfa, Texas, which is a town. I think right now their population is around 1,800. It's been steadily in decline since the early 1920s. The Wisconsin Dells, which is the water park capital of the world and one of our great brands in Wisconsin. And then the bottom one is Taliesin, which is the home of which is in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And so these are three small communities, each of them under 10,000. Certainly Marfa and Spring Green are under 5,000 apiece. That have successfully branded themselves. Marfa, Texas, if you haven't been there, is a small community that was home to Donald Judd, a modern artist who made this outpost in Texas a center of high concept art. And in this tiny town of 1,800, people come from all over the world to look at the art installations that are there. Included, the one you see in the picture is, and it's a tiny picture, it's a Prada store in the middle of nowhere. And it's not a real Prada store, but it's set up as an art display. And the Wisconsin Dells has made itself a tourist destination for the upper Midwest by marketing water parks year-round, indoor and outdoor water parks. And Spring Green is home to a large arts community that is particularly active. And so each of these three communities have brands around what their community can offer. And they're all valid, believable, they're very simple, they're very appealing, and they're very distinctive. We'll come back in a few minutes and we'll look at Spring Green in particular and their brand identity. So branding a community is a big task, and I think it's a much more complicated task than what we'd find if we were doing consumer products marketing. It's very easy to sell an Audi. It's a car. It goes fast. They're kind of attractive. That's an easy sell. It's a fairly straightforward product to sell. If you take that and you look at something like a community, and the picture you see on the right is Ephraim, Wisconsin, which is in Door County, Wisconsin. A community is a much more complicated thing, and there are a lot more stakeholders involved. And so when we say stakeholder-centered community branding, there aren't as many stakeholders in Audi. Audi is primarily concerned about keeping, but a community, we're talking about all of the different organizations and the people that are interested in that community, invested in that community some way, and we need to keep those happy. So let's talk what that works, or how that works. What doesn't work when we're branding a community is just kind of shouting loudly that this is our community brand. We're an arts community, or we're a water-based community, or we're a recreation community. Those kind of superficial attempts to put a brand on something without the involvement of stakeholders, sometimes they're successful, most often they're not, and they can flop. So we want to avoid jumping from the idea of branding a community to promoting it, to really building that stakeholder buy-in into the process. So that brings us to the very first question when we're discovering our brand. Who are our stakeholders for a community brand? That's the first big question. I've got three big questions in this slide set. So our first big set of stakeholders is when we do community branding, it's good to map who is in the community. That's always one of the first steps we try to take. Who are our media partners? Who is involved as our residents? Can we describe our residents through census data or mapped data, where they are, what they're like, what stages of life they might be in? Oh, and I'm sorry, I accidentally forwarded past that. What are our schools in our community? Do we have a full K through 12 offering? Are there universities? Are there technical schools? Does our community that we have in question have an elementary school, but children are bused to another community or transported to another community for high school? What is our Chamber of Commerce like? What community groups do we need to involve? Do we have churches, synagogues, mosques, house of worship, or formal worship groups that we need to consider when we're branding a community? And who is in our local government? And when we're doing stakeholder-centered community marketing and branding, we draw from these groups. We always try groups and involve them in the process so that we can be sure that whatever we identify as a community brand is representative of their experience, because we're really trying to articulate what the experience of the community is in a branded way. And these stakeholders keep in mind when we are coordinating the different project layers. And this is something that Victoria and I put together as we were going through branding processes with different communities. We have kind of this multi-layered approach to branding. We identify the stakeholders first, and then the project layers that we coordinate are not necessarily sequential, but things that are happening sometimes simultaneously. The very first box you see there is we are looking at the branding process that we're engaging with community leaders in. And oftentimes we're doing some sort of market research, surveys, we're doing focus groups, we're identifying some sort of branding identity and then implementing it. And that's a process that underlies all of this. That's one set of the project layer. The second set of the project layer is that we're trying to constantly communicate between the team we've organized to work on a brand and other stakeholders in the community who are not able to participate in that process. Because again, this team is just going to be the team that identifies the brand that represents the whole community. And we found through trial and error that constant communication with other stakeholders in the community to see if we're on the right track really saves a lot of time and enhances community buy-in. Once we've identified what we think is a community brand, before we launch it, we go through an evaluative phase where we take the brand to different groups and different individuals and we get their opinion and feedback and then adjust and tweak as we need to. And then we do this process kind of throughout the whole branding process, the discovery process, but then certainly afterwards, where we carefully document and archive everything that we've done along the steps. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because good brands live for a long time and we're planning for that long-term impact. 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, when the next set of people come along and talk about brand, they have a record, a clear record of what we've done and why the choices were made that were made. So that's sort of the first step, is identifying the stakeholders and then really being conscious of how we integrate the stakeholders into the process. The second big question we have is meeting with these stakeholders is what type of brand do we need for our community in order to advance community? Why is it that the community is going through a branding process at this moment in time? What makes it a good idea for now? And there are 4 basic types of brands for communities. There's an overarching community brand that just sort of articulates a general identity for a community. It doesn't mean that it's a general identity, that it's not a strong identity, that it's not a compelling identity, but it's really overarching, and it speaks possibly more to the resident experience of living in that place than it does to the aspect of other stakeholders like visitors or business owners. So the overarching community brands, one of our brands in Wisconsin is Madison, Wisconsin. The unofficial, very unofficial slogan for Madison, Wisconsin is 30 square miles surrounded by reality, and everybody that's ever lived here would agree that that's probably true, as would most of the state. It's a little odd here, and we like it that way. Destination brand is, 2 of our major destination brands are Door County, which is a major Midwest destination for those that want to seek sun and nice lake shores during the summertime. Wisconsin Dells, which is a strong theme park destination. And then there's a third one that we have a group of stakeholders in the north that are currently working on launching called the Middle Coast, that emphasizes the upper Superior, Lake Superior shoreline and the upper portion of Wisconsin, the waterfront access that we have up there. A third type of brand typology that we use, or type of brand, is economic development brand. The Paper Valley refers to the Appleton, Oshkosh, Neenah, Green Bay corridor, which was once home to the most paper companies anywhere in the world. And that slowly changed over the years as the paper industry has moved south. So while that's still kind of a compelling brand for those in the paper industry, it really doesn't resonate with residents there in economic development. So about 15, 20 years ago, they launched a brand called New North, Northeast Wisconsin North, that is designed to emphasize the technical capabilities of residents in that part of the state, that we have a lot of engineers, we have a lot of scientists in that portion of the state, we have a lot of highly trained skilled workers there. So they use that as an economic development brand. And then the thematic brand is one that oftentimes we use in tourism that identifies a subset of activities that is particularly strong in the area. And so Wisconsin Dells, while a tourist destination, has gotten a reputation in the last decade or so as the water park capital of the world, and that's a thematic brand. So the first thing we do is identify those stakeholders, bring them together and coordinate them through the different project layers. The second thing that we do is we identify why is it that we're branding? What type of brand do we think we need as a community? Because that directs a lot of the questions we ask as we're going through the process. The third step then is really discovering that identity. So we've brought people together, we've talked a little bit at this point in the process of why we're branding, where we think we're headed for a brand, and then that third big question is what is our identity as a community? This in branding is the biggest question, the hairiest question, the question that in my opinion is fun when you get into branding, because there are a few things as enjoyable as talking to people about why they love their communities. This is often a really enjoyable process. So when we look at what is our identity as a community, one of the key underlying ideas is that identity is never decided, it's always discovered. We have an identity as a community. Not a single person in that community can really identify the identity of the community on their own, because it's such a shared living thing, and not a single group of stakeholders can do that. We can't, the answer doesn't lie in the K-12 schools, it doesn't lie in the Chamber of Commerce, it doesn't lie in the churches. None of those organizations have the single answer. Instead, it's a process of coming together and really deciding as a group, what are we as a community? Why do we love it here? What do we want to talk about our community with when we get together with other people? So we do that in some ways that are really familiar to those in economic development. One of the first steps in discovering a community's identity is doing something that most of us in economic development have done time and time again, and that's doing a simple asset inventory. I'm looking at, who are our business and industry stakeholders, who's in the community, who's outside of the community that has a stake in our community. Oftentimes, and this is particularly true in Wisconsin, where we do a lot of manufacturing and export. Some of our community partners are across the globe. So what does our community mean to folks that do business in there and do business with us from other places? What is our education system like? What are our arts and recreation assets? What are our entertainment assets? What's our infrastructure look like? What are our natural resources in the area? And I'm sure if you've done economic development asset identification, you could add easily another 6 to 10 or half dozen things to this particular list. But that asset inventory ends up, for most communities, being the place that they start with. The second thing that we do then is we keep that in mind and we start asking people from the community what their experience of the community is like. And we can do this in a couple of different ways. We can do this in terms of surveys, where we send out surveys asking people about how cohesive they feel as a community, how much do they participate, how satisfied are they with community amenities. We can ask about their individual connections. How often do you spend a social evening with friends, with family, with neighbors, and looking at their demographics. So there's one way of doing it with surveys. That can also be accomplished through focus groups. It can be accomplished and should include really young people who might not have the ability to fill out a survey, but could certainly take a camera around or a camera phone and take pictures of what their community means to them. We bring all of this information back together and we sift through it and we look for kind of identifying factors, commonalities. And that helps us arrive at what that identity means. This particular step it can be a fairly lengthy and complicated process. I won't go into it with too more detail than that. You can get in touch with me personally and I'll give you the rundown of what we do sometimes. But in the interest of time, we'll fast forward and say that we take all of that information, and once we've identified what could be our potential identity as a community, we start thinking in terms of who are our target audiences, and how does the identity that we have, or we think we have as a community, help us connect with that target audience. And oftentimes when we're talking about target audiences for community branding, we're thinking of residents and workers, of course, but also visitors to the community, our business and industry partners, and our export market partners. And to give you an example of how that works on a very simple level, Spring Green, Wisconsin has as one of its target audiences visitors to that area. Spring Green is a small town that does a fair bit of its economy rests on visitors and tourists in the summertime in particular. And the pictures along the bottom of the slides that you're seeing are first an aerial shot of Spring Green. It's situated along the Wisconsin River in the southwestern part of Wisconsin. The second shot that you see there is the Spring Green Art Fair, which is one of the major occurrences that happens every summer. It's the home of Frank Lloyd Wright, which is one of their big claims to fame, and so Taliesin is there, along with a surprising number of buildings that he designed that bring tourists and architecture students from around the world. And then there's a very robust arts community. This is the final shot is of the American Players Theater with a Shakespeare in the Woods theater that operates for about 6 months out of the year. And there's a whole host of artists that make Spring Green their community that are in fine arts and performing arts and all sorts of things. So when Spring Green, Wisconsin looks at branding itself, one of their target audiences is visitors. Now we could have as a target audience residents, we could have as a target audience other community partners. There's a lot of communities, but for the example that I'm doing today, we'll just talk about visitors, so one layer of their stakeholders. When we've identified that identity for Spring Green and a target audience, we can identity as an arts community and a target audience, visitors. One of the first things we do is write a positioning statement. And so for Spring Green, Wisconsin, one positioning statement that they consider is Spring Green is the summertime art center of southwestern Wisconsin. And we test all of our positioning statements with the idea of, is there enough proof to support that? If we were to make this as an argument, if we were to put this up as a premise in a court of law, would we have enough proof to say that this is a valid, believable identity? So for proof for Spring Green, it does have the Taliesin preservation. There's a fair amount of hardscape architecture there. American Players Theater, there's an annual art fair, there's outdoor concerts, there's upward of several dozen artists that live in the area. So for this community, the idea of positioning itself, its identity as a summertime art center of southwestern Wisconsin, it's valid, it's believable. So when we go back and we check off that list that we had for community brand elements, it's valid, it's believable that Spring Green is a summertime art capital, it's simple, it's an easy one-sentence description of what it is, it's appealing, and it's also distinctive for southwestern Wisconsin. It places itself in a unique position for that portion of our state. So that's how we, in a really quick nutshell, identify community brands that are stakeholder based. Now the difference between a stakeholder based and a commerce based is at no point are we talking about necessarily overtly selling the community. We're not imposing the identity on the community, but trying to get the community involved in identifying what its brand is itself and bringing that up from the bottom. So this process takes, in my experience, this is a months-long process. It's incredibly enjoyable to do. It's very rewarding to do. It leads to subsequent steps. Typically, the next step after this, which we won't have time to go into today, is then using that community identity to come up with a slogan, logo, and imagery, the stuff that will eventually probably lend itself to a marketing or positioning campaign of some sort. But that branding step and discovering the identity is really the first step that goes into this. So with that, I think my 25 minutes are probably slightly more than up. Oh, yep, look, I'm on 29 minutes right now. So before I take questions, here's my contact information, and then I'm going to quickly go to the last slide and come back to this before I take questions. The Kotler book I talked to is Marketing Places, Attracting Industry Investment and Tourism to Cities, and then Destination Branding for Small Cities for Bill Baker as well. So two great resources. With that, does anyone have any questions that they'd like answered? You can type it in the chat room box.
Boy, thanks a lot, Kristen. I guess one question that popped to mind is a bit of a personal one. I live in the community of Bath, which is about 8 miles outside of Lansing, East Lansing, and it is home of one of the first high school terrorist incidents. There was a terrible bombing about, I can't remember, maybe about 60 years ago. And I didn't know that when we moved to Bath, but it's in some ways it's a brand, right? And so how, you think about how do you recreate a community brand when you start to realize, you get to know people and you realize, wow, this is something that is a part of the community and you can't really undo it. It's there, but do you have any advice about transcending and changing?
That, yeah, that is one of the most difficult challenges we face, not just as a community in healing within the community, but going forward in the fact that it becomes one of the stories that we tell about our communities when bad things like that happen. And Wisconsin is no stranger to that. We've had our share of high-profile incidents. Currently, Manitowoc, Wisconsin, if you watched, what's the Netflix, How to Make a Murderer series, is kind of in the thick of experiencing that right now. And so the important thing from a communication and branding perspective is, a big part of brands are the stories that we tell about our communities. And so when you talk about the incident in Bath, the tragedy in Bath, the story can end on the day that happened, or that can be the first chapter in a story. And the remainder of the story is how Bath comes together as a community and heals from that incident. It doesn't erase the collective memory of that incident, but it provides a coda that allows the community to establish an identity beyond that particular incident. And then, so that's one half of it. And then the other half of it is making sure the stories about the positive aspects of Bath, the places that are important, the sights, the sounds, the landscape, the experiences of living with Bath, that those aspects of the community are equally compelling in their storytelling. So it becomes a lot of the storytelling will mitigate that, but it does become kind of part of the place, a minimal part of the place after time goes on, but an important memory, but one that's, hopefully about healing.
Yeah.
And so I see Jason's got a question. How about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that we move to Jason, and I see Cindy put the date of the Bath event there as well.
Yeah, that was 1957, 67. It cruised by me pretty quickly. 1927. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and Jason asked the question: how about brands that are debatable? Eau Claire's Volume 1 magazine proclaimed it the music capital of the North, and that's probably because it's the home of Bon Iver, right? I would. Jason, I'm going to ask Jason, are you from Eau Claire or not Eau Claire or Minneapolis? Because this is, I predict that this is going to be a rivalry that we all benefit from if Minneapolis and St. Paul start arguing and releasing music to try to argue over who's got that title of the music capital of the North. A certain amount of branding is indeed hyperbole, and claiming an identity for yourself that might not be yours exclusively. I forget which beer it was. I want to say it was Old Milwaukee. Maybe it was Old Style, that was the first to brand themselves as using steam cleaned bottles. My advertising professor right now, if he was here, would hit his head on the wall saying, you should remember this. All beers, when beer was bottled in actual bottles, used steam clean bottles. This was the industry requirement and the standard, but whichever beer it was, I think it was Old Style, made their name by emphasizing that aspect of their beer, even though it was completely identical to the others. One of the things that we often encounter, communities within states are often in kind of a friendly competition with one another. Using similar or same assets. I was at a branding meeting for Sauk City, Prairie du Sac. We call it the Sauk Prairie area, which is outside of Madison. I was at a branding meeting the other day and was meeting with the county educator afterwards, and we were despairing because it's difficult to set a community like Sauk Prairie apart from other communities in the area. Sauk Prairie's got a lake, everybody else has a lake. Sauk Prairie's got a river, everybody else around here has one of those too. They've got a winery, there are a lot of wineries in the area. It's got a ski hill, well, we're not the only one with the ski hill. So when you look at it on the surface, you look at there's a lot of assets in that community. A lake, a river, a ski hill, a nice downtown, great local food, which is what every other community in the area also has. So to claim an identity as something unique becomes kind of sometimes a matter of getting to the microphone, for identifying that you have those assets and then getting to the microphone first. Keep Austin weird. I see Joshua Clemens says that's debatable. Also too, Madison, I've seen a t-shirt that says keep Madison, Wisconsin weird too. So a lot of these identities are not necessarily exclusive to the particular area that they're from. That's okay. If we're the first to get there with our community identity and we establish it strongly, then good for us, I say. Would branding work for something as small as a county department? Yes, it would. So if you have a department within your county, and I'm thinking parks and recreation departments, particularly at a county level, because they deal with some very tangible, attractive assets for a county. County parks departments often can develop a strong brand reputation based around one or more assets that they have particular experience with or depth in. A county department that parks, and I'm just using Parks and Rec as an example here, a county parks department that has a particularly strong offering for bike trails could certainly use that to its advantage to identify its county or to identify the different locations in its county, in addition to enhancing its own reputation on a regional or a national scale. That Iron County in Wisconsin is a great example. They have a phenomenal network of bike trails, and they do really a lot of forward-thinking development in that field, and can easily use that to brand the county as well as brand their reputation as leaders in that type of development. And the advantage for that, of course, then is as other communities around the region or the state are looking at developing bike trails or lakefronts or whatever it is, that you've got the strong brand around, come seeking your expertise and your advice for developing those things. So it benefits everybody in that sense. Do we have any other questions? I see Chris is typing. Yeah. What type of metrics can help you gauge the strength of your community's brand? So there are a number of ways to do that. I'm a big, and it's partially because this is my discipline, involves a lot of opinion work. I'm a big fan of survey work as, identifying a moment in time, a beginning point and an end point. If you do one, time series split surveys, a survey this year, a survey 5 years from now, around a community's brand to identify the resident experience of that community. That can be one metric, and that's an intentional, metric that requires somebody to sit down and craft and analyze and collect data for it. A second metric that you can use is if you're developing a brand around a particular offering, Eau Claire with music, for example. If Eau Claire is able to measure its tourism dollars or its industry dollars, how many people in town are making a living from music, how much income generation is there from music. If we look at something as simple as using Powerlytics or one of the other databases that they have out there that tap into tax returns, for example, even, that identify NAICS codes, and we're looking at music industry related income generation, we can chart that as it grows over time. That's one way of identifying it. A second way would be to track attendance at festivals, to look at the number of festivals that are developed over time, and really build a case with those numbers for Eau Claire thriving on the music industry, that music being a real economic driver, not just an enjoyable arts experience or a reason to stay in town. Yeah. To what degree are community brands aspirational? That's from Josh. I think community brands are almost always aspirational, even if we are articulating something that is already concretely there. And I say that because community brands really capture the positive essence when they're intentionally. Nobody would ever drop a negative brand for their community, but community brands that we're intentional about creating and that we cherish almost always speak to some aspect of the community that is important to us. It's a reason that we stay there, a reason that we enjoy our community, a reason that we call it our own. And so even saying it, a community is, Springfield anywhere is America's favorite neighborhood, or is America's best hometown. It might be a true statement. It's valid, believable, simple. It's appealing. It's distinctive, but it's also aspirational in that the creation and maintenance of that identity is something that's enjoyable and exciting and is really cherished. Yeah. So any other questions we have? Okay, so, and I see Jason's posted some information about the impact of music in Eau Claire. And I think that's real, and Eau Claire might make a really interesting case study if somebody was interested in looking into that. There's a lot, and I'm saying this as just an outside observer. I haven't actually done any work there yet, but there's been a lot that has been going on in that part of Wisconsin, and Eau Claire is the center. A lot of novelists, a lot of musicians who have made it home over the last 10 years. And so developing an identity around that growing field is certainly something that would be very profitable for a community like that, and not just in terms of economics, but in terms of being very rewarding in that sense. So what are my experiences, thoughts when branding a downtown? Bill Ryan in our department over here at the Center for Community and Economic Development is really our authority on a national stage for downtown redevelopment. And I wish he was in the office, in my office right now. I'd ask him a couple of questions or ask him to share his thoughts. But downtowns, in my experience, are a couple of things. It's an extension of the community itself, even if it's often at the heart of a community. Downtowns are key to developing kind of that street level culture. And I think the resurgence we've seen in downtowns over the last 10 to 20 years, where we're really trying to care for and cherish these spaces, really speak to their importance. And I'm preaching to the choir by saying that. I would assume most of you all agree with me. But when branding in downtown, the downtown brand should reflect the community as a whole, and it might be an amped up or a concentrated expression of what the community is. So if we're branding, let's use example. Let's use Nashville as an example. Nashville, National Music Center. Downtown Nashville reflects that brand identity. It has a lot of what is offered by that brand. There are music venues, there are record stores, there are places to buy instruments. You see musicians on the street in Nashville. All of these things that are happening in their downtown are a reflection of that identity. So let's say you have a community that has an outdoors brand, Bozeman, Montana, a great example of this. You go to downtown Bozeman, Montana, Bozeman located in what is possibly one of the best backyards any state has. We've got mountains in the background and all these great recreation activities, and then you go to downtown Bozeman, and there are places to eat outside even in January because it's an outdoors town all year round. There are places to buy ski gear, hiking gear, all of these things about the Bozeman brand and Bozeman being an outdoor center community are reflected in that downtown and found in that downtown. So when branding a downtown, it really should be an extension of what that community is and a reflection of that community's brand, in my opinion. And in my experience, that's been what's successful.
Well, Kristen, I think maybe this is a good spot to stop. Really great discussion. Really good. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll close with the brand that my wife and I have 6 kids, and they decided they didn't use this term, but they branded our house, and they caught our little plot out, in Bath, and they call it the crowded hammock. So I
Oh,
thought that was a fun brand for the house.
that is, and that evokes all sorts of great imagery, which if we were doing the next step in this and talking about how brands should evoke imagery, that would be a great example to start with. Because I can picture your backyard now with a hammock and a lot of kids trying to get into it and a whole lot of Kool-Aid and marshmallow roasting and all sorts of fun things happening. What a great brand. What a great image. Thank you, Mark, for having me today. This has been really great.
Oh, thanks everyone, and thank you very much, Kristen.
You're
Have a
welcome.
great afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.